And I said, no, I need it. I really need it tonight.
At 99 years old, Mel Brooks sits surrounded by silence that once trembled with laughter. The rooms that echoed with applause now hold something heavier, names never spoken aloud, memories carefully buried beneath decades of jokes, masks, and survival. Fame taught the world to see him as invincible, a man who turned pain into punchlines, tragedy into triumph. But behind the laughter lived resentment, betrayal, and a quiet fury he carried longer than any award. 5 actors, 5 relationships that fractured something essential inside him. 5 reminders that success does not protect the soul. This story does not begin with comedy. It begins with war, loss, and the lifelong instinct to armor oneself with humor. It asks a dangerous question. What does it cost to be loved by millions, but misunderstood by those closest to the work? As time closes in and memory becomes merciless, Mel Brooks finally allows himself to look back, not to accuse, but to unburden. Why did these collaborations turn into wounds? And why did he wait until the very end to tell the truth? Silence arrives before memory. In the dim quiet of an old room, Mel Brooks is no longer surrounded by laughter, but by echoes of survival that began long before cameras, stages, or applause ever existed. His story opens in absence, in the hollow left by war, fear, and sudden loss. He was young when the world taught him impermanence. World War II did not merely shape his future, it rewired his instincts. Danger trained his eyes to watch rooms carefully, to read faces, to anticipate collapse. Laughter emerged not as joy, but as armor. Against silence, grief, and fear alone. Loss arrived early, carving a permanent vacancy inside him. His father's absence became a quiet ache, a lesson that love could disappear without warning. From that wound grew vigilance. Trust felt dangerous. Closeness felt temporary. Humor became the safest distance between himself and pain in a trembling, uncertain world beyond. In uniform, surrounded by uncertainty, Mel learned observation over expression. Silence became survival. He watched how men laughed louder when afraid, how jokes softened terror's edge. These lessons stayed. Comedy sharpened into a tool, precise and controlled, allowing him to shape chaos without ever surrendering control to hostile fate outside. Even after the war, the nervous system never forgot. Success had not yet arrived, but preparation for loss had. Inside him formed an emotional architecture built for retreat. Admiration felt unstable. Praise sounded temporary. He learned to expect withdrawal, to brace before attachment could fully take hold within fragile bonds. Hollywood remained distant, almost mythic, but the path toward it was already colored by fear. Dreams carried conditions. Opportunity demanded exposure. To be seen meant to risk being hurt. Each step forward awakened the old instinct to hide, to protect the core that humor kept guarded from sudden emotional ruin. In crowded rooms, he learned to lead with wit while withholding himself. Laughter opened doors without inviting intimacy. Applause felt safer than affection. The young man understood something instinctively. Reliance created leverage for others. Independence, even emotional, felt like survival. That belief hardened quietly, invisibly, over years, scars, fears, accumulating. This internal logic would later define his collaborations. Precision over vulnerability. Control over surrender. He would demand excellence, but struggle with closeness. What others saw as intensity was protection. What felt like genius was partly fear refined into craft, polished until invisible, yet always present beneath success and looming trust. The future waited just beyond reach, shimmering with promise and threat. Entering entertainment meant partnership, exposure, reliance on unpredictable people. His armor, once life-saving, now risked becoming a barrier. The tension grew quietly, unresolved, as he stood at the threshold of a world demanding trust from guarded instincts, memories, alone. As Mel stepped forward, opportunity and danger converged. The instinct to protect himself tightened even as collaboration became unavoidable. Laughter still led the way, but something fragile trailed behind it. The stage lights brightened, and with them rose an unspoken question that would shape everything ahead from this moment onward. Brooklyn does not appear as nostalgia in Mel Brooks' memory. It arrives in fragments, brick buildings pressing close, voices layered in accents, ambition mixed with exhaustion. This was a place of movement, of people chasing permanence in a world that rarely offered it. For Mel, childhood was shaped less by comfort than by adaptation. The defining absence came early. His father's death did not explode into his life. It receded, leaving behind a quiet void that redefined everything. There was no dramatic goodbye, only a sudden understanding that foundations could vanish without warning. Permanence, he learned, was an illusion adults pretended to believe in. The household carried on, but something essential was gone, and young Mel learned to live around that hollow space. In that absence, humor began to grow, not as joy, but as control. When the room laughed, it meant attention had shifted. Pain paused. The world felt briefly predictable. Comedy became a way to steer emotional weather, to redirect discomfort before it settled too deeply. Laughter created structure where life had removed it. Psychologically, this training shaped his expectations. Disappointment was assumed. Attachment was approached cautiously. Even as he craved connection, he learned to ration vulnerability. He could be seen, admired, even loved, but only from a safe distance. Humor allowed intimacy without exposure, admiration without surrender. Schoolyards and street corners became rehearsal spaces. Mel watched reactions carefully, refining timing, learning what landed and what fell flat. He understood instinctively that approval could vanish as quickly as it appeared. That awareness sharpened him, but it also hardened something inside. He learned to leave first, emotionally, before anyone else could. Creative ambition emerged from this tension. It was not only the desire to perform, but the need to be recognized on his own terms. To be visible without being defenseless. Comedy offered that paradox. It invited attention while disguising vulnerability. He could stand at the center of a room and still keep his true self protected behind wit and rhythm. Relationships followed the same pattern. Friends, teachers, early collaborators, Mel connected intensely but cautiously. There was always an exit prepared, a psychological escape route if admiration turned cold or ego entered the room. This vigilance felt necessary, even wise. It had kept him safe before. But what protects a child can complicate an adult. As Mel's talent matured, the habits formed in childhood came with him. The instinct to anticipate betrayal, to control dynamics before they could shift, began to quietly influence how he navigated people. Admiration energized him, but also triggered unease. Praise raised expectations, and expectations carried risk. As he stepped closer to the entertainment world, these survival skills felt like strengths, discipline, awareness, self-reliance. Yet beneath them, something fragile stirred. The very instincts that once protected him were preparing to clash with a world that demanded collaboration, trust, and shared power. And that conflict was already waiting, just beyond the smile. Success does not arrive as a celebration. It enters quietly, almost deceptively, through open doors that still carry shadows. For Mel Brooks, the rise begins with rooms filled with people, yet strangely absent of safety. Writers' tables, rehearsal halls, studios humming with ambition, spaces designed for collaboration, but charged with unspoken competition. His talent is undeniable. Doors open because of his mind, his timing, his relentless precision. Yet with every opportunity comes exposure. The protective distance he perfected in childhood is suddenly harder to maintain. Comedy now requires partnership. Timing depends on others. Trust becomes unavoidable, and that necessity unsettles something deep inside him. Mel leads with intensity. He watches closely how people react to authority, how quickly admiration shifts when ego enters the room. He gives everything to the work, demanding the same in return, not out of cruelty, but fear. Control still feels like safety. Precision feels like survival. When collaborators push back, it doesn't register as creative dialogue. It feels like threat. On the surface, the ascent looks triumphant. Laughter follows him. Applause grows louder. His name carries weight. But internally, the rooms feel lonelier than ever. The higher he climbs, the more he senses distance widening between himself and those around him. Fame magnifies everything: talent, insecurity, resentment, until nothing feels neutral anymore. Actors enter his orbit, each bringing their own hunger, their own need to be seen. Some mirror his intensity. Others challenge it. What might have been simple creative tension becomes psychologically charged. Mel feels watched, measured, tested. Old instincts awaken, the need to stay one step ahead emotionally, to anticipate conflict before it explodes. He begins to internalize slights that others barely notice. A delayed response. A joke delivered with different emphasis. A moment where laughter belongs to someone else. None of it is spoken aloud, but all of it is recorded inside him. These are not tantrums of ego. They are echoes of a child who learned that admiration could vanish without warning. Loneliness takes a specific shape at this stage, not absence, but overload. Too many people, too many expectations, too much noise. The work becomes refuge. Long hours offer structure, control over scripts, pacing, tone. This is where he feels safest. People, meanwhile, remain unpredictable variables. Some collaborations sparkle briefly, almost joyfully. For a moment, Mel allows himself to believe in shared vision, mutual respect. But when disagreements surface, the disappointment cuts deeper than it should. Creative conflict transforms into emotional rupture. The past quietly overlays the present, and the reaction feels disproportionate even to him. What others perceive as rigidity is, internally, a tightening grip against loss. Mel does not yet see the pattern forming. He only feels exhaustion, being surrounded yet unseen, admired yet guarded. The rise continues, but it does not feel like arrival. It feels like standing alone on a widening platform, lights bright enough to blind. And somewhere within this ascent, one collaboration crosses an invisible line. A moment so subtle it barely registers publicly, yet sharp enough to leave a permanent mark. Mel does not confront it. He stores it. And that decision, silence over resolution, will shape everything that follows, even before he realizes its cost. At the height of his influence, Mel Brooks becomes more than a creator. He becomes gravity. Projects bend around his vision. Rooms quiet when he speaks. Laughter follows, but now it carries expectation, obligation, and scrutiny. Fame has sharpened his authority, but it has also compressed his emotional space. There is less room to be human when genius becomes a brand. Studios feel different now, brighter, louder, heavier. Every decision echoes. Every collaboration is observed. Actors arrive with reverence, ambition, and sometimes defiance. Mel senses it immediately. He has always been perceptive, but pressure heightens his sensitivity. He notices when enthusiasm turns performative, when loyalty feels conditional, when respect quietly negotiates with ego. Psychologically, leadership tightens around him like a vice. To relinquish control feels dangerous. To be challenged feels destabilizing. His standards are unforgiving, not because he seeks dominance, but because he fears chaos. Precision is still protection. Authority is still armor. Yet the cost of that armor is growing heavier with each production. Certain actors begin to push against his rhythm. They improvise where he demands structure. They question choices he believes are settled. To outsiders, it looks like creative tension. Inside Mel, it feels like erosion. Each challenge triggers an old alarm. Admiration slipping, control weakening, stability threatened. The reaction is immediate, internal, and deeply personal. He does not explode. He retreats inward. Silence replaces dialogue. The distance he mastered in childhood resurfaces with precision. Smiles remain. Professionalism holds. But trust fractures invisibly. What might have been resolved through conversation calcifies into resentment through avoidance. Mel convinces himself that discipline requires restraint, that emotional confrontation would only weaken authority. The irony is cruel. His fame grants him power, yet leaves him more isolated than ever. Surrounded by collaborators, he feels increasingly alone. Praise no longer reassures him, it pressures him. Success feels conditional, always at risk of slipping away through misstep or misjudgment. The higher the pedestal, the more precarious the balance. One collaboration, in particular, sharpens this tension into something irreversible. An actor challenges not just a creative choice, but Mel's identity as the unseen architect of the work. The moment is brief, almost forgettable to those present, but inside Mel it detonates. It is not the challenge itself, but what it represents: loss of authority, loss of respect, loss of control. He responds not with confrontation, but withdrawal. The decision is swift, instinctive, and absolute. A line is crossed, and though no words mark it, something closes permanently. Mel continues working, continues producing brilliance, but the emotional contract is severed. This is not anger. It is disillusionment. From that moment forward, Mel carries the fracture quietly. He becomes more exacting, more guarded. Collaborations become transactional rather than relational. Trust is replaced by expectation. Laughter still fills the room, but it no longer invites connection. It enforces rhythm, discipline, order. The world sees triumph. Awards accumulate. Influence expands. But beneath the surface, the cost is mounting. The cracks beneath genius are widening, fed by pressure and silence. Mel does not yet name the feeling, but he knows something has shifted. A name has been mentally recorded, set aside, never to be spoken aloud. This is the first time he understands that some wounds do not fade with success. Some are carried forward, quietly shaping the future. And as the lights grow brighter and the stakes higher, Mel Brooks realizes, too late, that one fallout has already become irreversible. Time does not erase the past, it rearranges it. For Mel Brooks, memory becomes a long corridor lined with doors he rarely opens. Behind some are triumphs replayed endlessly by the world. Behind others are names he learned never to say out loud. Not because they were secret, but because they carried weight, too heavy to lift without consequence. These were not enemies in the traditional sense. They were collaborators, partners in creation, people whose faces appeared beside his in the afterglow of success. Each relationship began with promise, shared ambition, and the fragile hope that mutual respect could survive pressure. And yet, one by one, something fractured. Not always dramatically, often quietly, often invisibly. One name represents disrespect, a moment when effort was dismissed, when authority was subtly undermined in a room full of witnesses. Another carries the sting of abandonment, a collaborator who withdrew emotionally, just as success demanded unity. Another reminds him of humiliation, a public moment where laughter shifted direction, leaving him exposed in ways comedy was never meant to allow. One name lingers in silence, defined not by conflict, but by absence, by what was never defended, never clarified, never repaired. Mel does not catalog these moments with anger. The emotion is more complex, more corrosive. It is disappointment that never found language. He internalized each fracture, believing professionalism required restraint. He told himself that silence was maturity, that moving forward mattered more than resolution. But the body remembers what the mouth refuses to speak. Psychologically, each name becomes a marker, a reminder of boundaries violated, trust misjudged, vulnerability punished. These were not isolated incidents. They echoed earlier lessons learned in childhood. Admiration had once again proven unstable. Closeness had once again carried cost. The pattern was familiar, even if the setting was grander. As years passed, these unresolved conflicts shaped how Mel navigated every new collaboration. He became more guarded, more selective, less forgiving of ambiguity. Standards hardened. Distance increased. What others perceived as intensity or control was, at its core, self-preservation refined by experience. The names stayed locked away, but their influence spread quietly across his work. There were moments, late nights, quiet rooms, brief flashes of regret, when he wondered if things could have unfolded differently. If a conversation might have softened the rupture. If acknowledgement might have healed what silence preserved. But time moved forward relentlessly, and opportunities for repair slipped away unnoticed. Some of the actors moved on. Some thrived. Some disappeared from his orbit entirely. Death claimed a few before reconciliation was ever possible. With each loss, the finality settled deeper. The chance to speak, to clarify, to unburden, closed without ceremony. What remained was memory, sharpened by age and reflection. Approaching the end of his life, Mel begins to understand that hatred is not what he carried. Hatred requires heat. What he held was colder, heavier, unfinished emotion, unexpressed truth. The names mattered not because they were villains, but because they represented moments where trust failed and was never rebuilt. Now, with time narrowing and legacy looming, the silence feels less protective and more suffocating. The question shifts. It is no longer whether speaking would cause damage, But whether remaining silent has already done so, to himself. Memory presses closer. The names wait patiently, unchanged by decades. As Mel sits with this realization, a new tension emerges. Age has stripped away urgency, but it has also removed fear. For the first time, he considers that truth might not destroy what he built. It might clarify it. The names he never said begin to surface, not as accusations, but as weight he is finally ready to set down. And with that awareness comes an unsettling possibility, that silence, once chosen for survival, may no longer serve him. The truth is there now, fully formed, waiting. The only question left is whether he will finally allow himself to speak it. The applause fades slowly, then all at once. For Mel Brooks, the later years do not arrive with celebration, but with a thinning of noise. Phones ring less often. Rooms feel larger. The industry that once revolved around momentum now moves forward without needing his constant presence. What remains is time, long, unstructured, and unavoidably reflective. Aging alters the texture of memory. Moments once buried rise without invitation. Names surface unprompted. Faces return sharper than expected. The conflicts he carried silently now have space to breathe. There are fewer distractions, fewer scripts demanding attention, fewer deadlines capable of outrunning thought. Silence, once a tool, becomes a mirror. Psychologically, this period is not defined by regret, but by reckoning. Mel does not replay victories. He revisits fractures. He thinks of conversations that ended too early, of rooms left without resolution, of collaborators who drifted out of reach before understanding could arrive. The absence of closure begins to weigh heavier than the conflicts themselves. Loss compounds reflection. Friends disappear. Peers pass away. Some of the actors tied to those unresolved tensions are no longer alive. Death introduces a cruel finality. There will be no clarifying conversation, no late apology, no shared acknowledgement of misunderstanding. What was left unsaid becomes permanent. Mel feels guilt, but not the kind rooted in wrongdoing. It is the guilt of emotional withholding, of choosing professionalism over honesty, of mistaking restraint for strength. He wonders how many times silence protected him, and how many times it quietly isolated him. The distinction grows less clear with each passing year. In public, his legacy remains intact, celebrated, revered, untouchable. But privately, the human cost of success emerges more clearly. The discipline that sustained him now feels rigid. The emotional distance that once ensured survival now reads as loss. He recognizes the irony. He mastered comedy, yet avoided confrontation. He orchestrated connection on stage, yet struggled to maintain it offstage. Nights stretch longer. Memory becomes less linear, more emotional. Moments return not as facts, but as sensations, tightened chests, withheld words, the instinctive pull away from vulnerability. He begins to see how unresolved wounds do not disappear, they wait. As his life approaches its final chapters, the urgency shifts. Legacy no longer feels like reputation, but honesty. He understands now that silence was never neutral. It shaped relationships, hardened perceptions, and limited intimacy. The realization is not devastating, it is sobering. Mel begins to ask a question he once avoided, whether truth, even late, might still offer release. Not reconciliation, some doors are permanently closed, but clarity. The weight he has carried for decades presses closer, demanding acknowledgement. In the long quiet after the applause, Mel Brooks faces a choice stripped of career consequences and public risk. What remains is only the self, aging, reflective, unguarded. And in that stillness, he senses that the truth, long avoided, is no longer something to fear, but something to confront before time decides for him. Honesty arrives quietly, not as confession, not as absolution, but as fatigue. For Mel Brooks, the drive to protect himself finally weakens under the weight of time. There is no longer an audience to impress, no industry politics to navigate, no future role that could be jeopardized by truth. What remains is memory and the responsibility of how it is carried. This chapter unfolds in stillness. Long pauses, thoughtful silences. Mel revisits the past not to assign blame, but to understand it without the urgency of survival. Distance has softened the edges of resentment, revealing something more complex beneath: fear, misunderstanding, emotional misalignment. The hatred he once believed he held dissolves under scrutiny. What remains is disappointment, layered with regret and clarity. For the first time, Mel allows himself to examine his own rigidity. He recognizes how often control replaced conversation, how silence became his preferred response to emotional discomfort. He sees how leadership hardened into authority, how expectations replaced curiosity. The patterns are undeniable now, no longer threatening to acknowledge. He understands that the actors he struggled with were not villains, but mirrors, reflecting his own guardedness, his intolerance for unpredictability, his fear of losing command. Their egos clashed with his not because one was larger, but because both were protecting something fragile. This realization does not excuse behavior, but it contextualizes it. And context, finally, brings relief. Memory becomes humane. The moments once defined by anger are reframed through empathy. Mel considers how pressure distorts people, how success amplifies insecurity on all sides. He no longer flinches from the names. He says them internally, without tension. They are no longer weapons or wounds, just truths that shaped him. This reckoning is not gentle. There is grief in recognizing missed opportunities for understanding. There is sorrow in accepting that some damage was mutual and some reconciliation impossible. But there is also freedom. He is no longer rehearsing defenses. He is no longer protecting an image. The armor that once defined him begins to loosen. Psychologically, this shift is profound. Mel realizes that survival instincts do not have to govern reflection. The past no longer threatens his future. He can afford to be honest now, even if honesty complicates the story, especially if it does. The idea of speaking openly no longer feels like betrayal of legacy. It feels like completion. He understands that withholding truth did not preserve relationships, it merely froze them. And frozen things, left untouched, do not heal. They wait. As this clarity settles, a decision forms, not impulsive, not dramatic, but inevitable. The truth is ready. Not sharpened for accusation, not softened for comfort. Just whole. The final question is no longer whether the world can handle his honesty, but whether he can carry the weight of silence any longer. With time narrowing and memory steady, Mel Brooks stands at the edge of revelation, not to rewrite history, but to finally tell it without fear. The end does not arrive with a punchline. It arrives with stillness. At 99, Mel Brooks exists in a space few reach, a vantage point where life stretches behind him in full relief. The noise has faded. The arguments have cooled. What remains is perspective, wide and unforgiving in its clarity. He no longer measures legacy by awards or influence, but by emotional truth, by what endured beneath the laughter. Comedy, he understands now, was never the point. It was the vehicle, a way to survive grief, to transform fear into rhythm, to shape chaos into something human. The world celebrated the jokes, the brilliance, the audacity. But the deeper story lived underneath, the cost of control, the weight of silence, the distance created by self-protection. Those truths waited patiently for acknowledgement. The 5 names no longer stand as symbols of hatred. They are lessons. Each represents a moment where fear overtook vulnerability, where survival instincts overrode connection. They are reminders that genius does not exempt anyone from emotional consequence. That success can coexist with misunderstanding. That laughter can live beside unresolved pain. Mel does not seek forgiveness, nor does he offer absolution. This is not redemption in the cinematic sense. It is acceptance. He accepts that he was shaped by loss, that his armor served him well, and that it also cost him intimacy. Both can be true. Both are part of the story. Legacy, he realizes, is not cleanliness. It is complexity. The willingness to be seen fully, not just as the architect of joy, but as a human shaped by fear, discipline, and guarded hope. By finally naming the fractures, he does not diminish his work. He deepens it. The laughter becomes richer when its origins are understood. In quiet moments, he reflects on what remains after the final curtain. Not the applause, but the impact. Not the perfection, but the honesty. He understands that stories endure not because they are flawless, but because they are true. And truth, even when delayed, carries its own form of grace. There is peace in this realization. Not comfort, but calm. The calm that comes from no longer holding back. from allowing the past to exist without defense, from releasing the need to control how history remembers him. The world will continue to laugh. Films will replay. Names will be celebrated. But beneath it all, another legacy settles quietly into place. The legacy of a man who survived, who created, who protected himself fiercely, and who, at the very end, chose honesty over silence. The story closes not with accusation, not with bitterness, but with understanding. Mel Brooks does not rewrite his past. He finally lets it speak. And in that final act, not of comedy, but of courage, his legacy becomes complete.